3 times a day. What the rancher did next changed history. The chill of the early morning air brushed against his face as he stepped out of the small wooden house that sat at the edge of his ranch. The horizon was painted in soft shades of pink and orange, a quiet promise of the day to come. Around him, the ranch stretched wide, open fields dotted with grazing cattle and framed by distant hills. This land had been in his family for generations, and he treated it with a care that went beyond simple ownership. It was a responsibility, a way of life, and a part of who he was. John moved with purpose, checking the fences first. Each post was solid, each wire tight. The ranch was his world, and the fences marked the boundaries of order in that world. A broken fence could mean lost cattle, wasted time, and unnecessary stress. So John made sure to inspect them carefully, walking the perimeter in silence, listening to the soft rustle of grass and the occasional lowing of cows. He had always believed that small details made the biggest difference. By the time the sun fully rose, John was already back near the house, tending to the morning chores. His wife Martha was in the kitchen preparing breakfast, the smell of fresh bread and coffee filling the air. Their children, Emily and Sam, still rubbed sleep from their eyes but moved with familiarity around the kitchen, knowing their roles in the morning routine. Breakfast was simple but hearty: eggs, bread, and a few slices of bacon. Conversation was quiet, practical, focused on the day ahead. It was not a life of luxury, but it was honest, grounded, and full of purpose. After breakfast, John grabbed his hat and boots and headed toward the barn. The morning routine was well established: feeding the animals, cleaning the stalls, checking the water troughs, and ensuring that every animal was healthy. Horses neighed softly as he approached, and he patted each one, speaking in low, steady tones that seemed to calm them. The cows followed him in a slow, deliberate parade, knowing the rhythm of his steps and the timing of his calls. Every movement, every check, every small act was part of a rhythm he maintained 3 times a day: morning, afternoon, and evening. There was a comfort in the repetition. John had learned early that consistency was as important as hard work. While others might rush through chores or skip small checks, he knew that careful observation often revealed problems before they became disasters. A cow that limped slightly, a fence that sagged under pressure, a water trough that ran low — these were signs that could save or ruin a day, and he never ignored them. By late morning, the sun had climbed higher, warming the land and casting long shadows across the fields. John walked toward the far pasture where a small herd of young cattle grazed near the creek. He paused to watch them, noting the way they moved, the way their coats shone in the sunlight. He knew each animal by sight, by sound, by behavior. It was more than work. It was care, respect, and a kind of silent understanding. John's thoughts often wandered during these quiet walks. He thought about the history of the land, about the generations of millers who had worked these fields before him. He thought about the challenges of ranching, the droughts, the storms, the unpredictable markets, but also about the satisfaction of seeing life thrive under his guidance. It was a life of labor, yes, but also of quiet triumphs. Each day brought new lessons, new problems to solve, and new ways to grow. Despite the hard work, John never rushed. He believed in patience. A fence post needed time to set, a calf needed careful feeding, a horse needed gentle handling. Hurrying only led to mistakes, and mistakes could be costly. He moved steadily, deliberately, his hands and eyes attuned to every detail. The ranch was alive with small signs and subtle changes, and he had learned to read them like a book. As noon approached, John returned to the house for a brief rest and a quick lunch. Martha had prepared a simple meal of bread, cheese, and cold meat. They ate together, sharing observations about the morning and plans for the afternoon. Even in these small moments, John found satisfaction in the rhythm of life, the sense of accomplishment that came from knowing the ranch was in good order. The afternoon brought another round of checks, the second of the day. John walked the fields again, inspecting crops, water sources, and fences. He stopped by the creek, watching the water flow over rocks, noting the condition of the banks. The land spoke to him in ways others might not notice: the way grass bent in the wind, the patterns of birds in the sky, the health of plants and animals alike. He had learned to listen, to watch, and to understand. Visitors occasionally came to the ranch, usually neighbors or buyers interested in cattle. John treated them with courtesy, but rarely let them distract him from his work. He had learned long ago that the land required more attention than any conversation could demand. Yet he never refused to share knowledge or advice. Many neighbors came to respect his methods, noticing how his cattle were healthy, his fields were productive, and his animals were well cared for. Some even began to imitate his careful routines, though few matched the diligence he brought to every day. Evenings were a time of reflection. After the final round of checks, John would sit on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the sun set over the hills. The sky turned brilliant shades of orange and purple, and the ranch was bathed in soft light. It was a time for quiet thought, for planning the next day, and for appreciating the life he had built. The work was never done, and tomorrow would bring the same routine. But that was the rhythm he loved, the pattern that gave meaning to his days. His children often joined him, asking questions about the animals, the land, or the history of the ranch. John answered patiently, teaching them not just the mechanics of ranching, but also the values of responsibility, observation, and perseverance. He wanted them to understand that life was built in small steps, repeated faithfully, with care and attention. These lessons he hoped would carry forward long after he was gone. As night fell, the ranch became quiet, the animals settling in for rest, the wind whispering through the trees. John performed his final checks, ensuring that all was secure. The fences held, the water was sufficient, and the animals were safe. He walked back to the house, tired but satisfied. This was the life he had chosen, the life he cherished, and the life that shaped him as much as he shaped it. Before bed, John often sat by the window, looking out over the fields. He marveled at the simplicity and complexity of his world, simple in its routine, complex in its demands and rewards. He knew that each day mattered, that each small act of care had consequences that rippled through the ranch and the lives it touched. And he knew that it was the attention to detail, the steadfast routine, and the quiet dedication that made all the difference. In those early years, John could not have imagined that the patterns he followed, checking his land and cattle 3 times a day, observing every detail, acting on every insight, would one day lead to something far greater than his own ranch. For now, it was enough to walk the fields, to care for the animals, to live in harmony with the land. But the seeds of something larger were quietly taking root in his mind, shaped by routine, patience, and relentless observation. The sun had long set when John finally climbed into bed. The house was still, the family asleep, and the ranch rested under the moonlight. He lay awake for a while, thinking about the coming day, the work that awaited him, and the subtle patterns he had noticed in his fields. Though the day had been ordinary in its chores and routine, he felt a quiet satisfaction, a sense that every small effort mattered. The rhythm of his life, the 3 times a day checks, the careful observation, the steady work, was not just a habit. It was a way of shaping the world around him, one small act at a time. And so the days went on, each one following the same pattern, yet never quite the same. Each sunrise brought new challenges and small victories. Each morning, afternoon, and evening, John Miller walked his ranch, cared for his animals, and watched the land, little knowing that this steadfast dedication would one day lead to changes far beyond the rolling fields he called home. The days on the ranch had always been challenging, but recently, John Miller noticed that something was different. The sun seemed harsher than usual, and the wind carried a dry, dusty smell. Grass that had always been green and strong was turning brittle and pale. He frowned as he walked across the fields, checking on his cattle for the 2nd time that day. Their movement seemed slower, and some cows nuzzled the earth as if searching for water that was no longer as plentiful. John had always prepared for challenges. He understood that ranching was a life of constant observation and action, but this was different. The creek that usually ran clear and steady had begun to shrink. Stones that had once been hidden beneath the water now jutted up, dry and sharp. The young calves seemed thirstier, pawing at the dirt and looking toward the small spring at the edge of the property as if it might offer some relief. He paused and studied the spring. It was smaller than usual, but somehow it still flowed while other water sources had dried. He had passed it countless times without much thought, but today he noticed something unusual. The spring water bubbled up with a steady rhythm, and the flow seemed almost deliberate, almost like it was resisting the heat and dryness surrounding it. John knelt beside it, letting his hand dip into the cool water and watched the sunlight glint on the surface. He felt a spark of hope. Perhaps this spring could help him save his cattle if he could figure out a way to manage it carefully. But hope alone would not be enough. John knew that he needed action. He began making plans in his mind, walking along the perimeter of the ranch and imagining the ways he could channel the water, store it, and use it efficiently. He would need to move fast before the drought worsened. This wasn't just about his ranch anymore. If he failed, the animals would suffer, and the small community around him might feel the consequences as well. Word of the drought spread quickly. Neighboring ranchers were struggling even more, and county officials began to worry about the region. Some suggested selling off cattle or abandoning parts of their land entirely. John attended a small meeting in the town hall with other ranchers. Faces were drawn, voices tense, and the room filled with anxious murmurs. The discussion was full of worry but no clear solutions. People complained, argued, and debated, but the crisis seemed larger than any individual effort. John listened quietly. He did not speak much, but he studied the room, noticing small details, who seemed genuinely worried, who was ready to give up, and who still held hope. He could feel a growing tension, a sense of helplessness that clung to the crowd. Yet within him, he felt determination. He knew he had to act. He had observed patterns in the land for years, paying attention to details others might overlook. And now, those small observations could make all the difference. He returned to the ranch and began experimenting. The first step was to secure the spring and ensure that the water would not be wasted. He dug small channels and created shallow troughs to guide the flow toward the areas where his cattle needed it most. He checked the water 3 times a day, morning, afternoon, and evening, carefully noting the changes in flow, temperature, and volume. Each visit taught him something new. Some channels were too shallow, others too deep, and adjustments were made with patience and precision. The neighboring ranchers watched him with curiosity and skepticism. Some whispered that he was wasting his time, that no simple method could save cattle during such a severe drought. But John did not waver. He had always believed that persistence and careful observation mattered more than words of doubt. Each morning, as he stepped onto his fields, he felt a quiet confidence, a sense that he was on the right path. Over the following days, small signs of success began to appear. The cattle that had looked weak and thirsty now moved with more energy. Their coats appeared shinier and their steps more confident. John smiled quietly as he watched them drink from the carefully managed water channels. The land itself seemed to respond. Grass near the spring remained green, even as other areas turned brown and brittle. John knew that this success was fragile, that any mistake could undo all the work, but he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He began taking notes, sketching the layout of the water channels, marking the places where adjustments were needed, and recording the behavior of the cattle. These notes became a personal guide, a plan that could be refined with each passing day. He worked steadily 3 times a day without complaining, without seeking attention. The rhythm of his life, the same careful routine that had guided him for years, had now become a tool for survival. Meanwhile, the community began to notice. Some neighbors who had mocked him at first now approached with questions. "John, how do you keep your cattle alive when ours are struggling?" one asked, eyes wide with curiosity. John smiled gently, never boasting, but he shared what he could. Observations about the spring, ideas about channeling water, and the importance of daily care. Slowly, people began to try small parts of his methods. Some succeeded, others failed, but the knowledge began to spread. John also faced setbacks. One afternoon, a sudden gust of wind toppled part of a channel he had dug. The water spilled onto the dry earth, and he felt frustration rising. Yet he did not despair. He repaired the damage quickly, reinforced the channel, and learned from the failure. Each mistake taught him something new. Each small success reinforced the value of patience and careful attention. The drought continued for weeks, testing the limits of every rancher in the region. Some lost large portions of their cattle, while others struggled to keep their herds alive. John's ranch was not untouched. He lost a few animals, and some crops failed. But overall, the careful management of the spring made a difference. It was proof that thoughtful observation and steady action could overcome even severe challenges. As the weeks passed, John began to notice patterns in the spring that were almost imperceptible. The water level rose slightly after a rainstorm, even if it was far away. The flow changed subtly depending on the time of day and temperature. John recorded these observations meticulously, realizing that the land itself was giving him clues about how to manage it. It was as if the ranch was speaking to him, and he had learned to listen. Evenings on the ranch were quieter now, filled with reflection rather than simple rest. John would sit on the porch, looking over the fields, watching his cattle and thinking about the future. He knew that the drought would not last forever, but he also knew that the lessons he was learning were permanent. The value of observation, persistence, and careful planning could not be measured in days or months. It was a principle that could shape the entire ranching practice in the region. His family watched him work with admiration. Martha offered quiet support, preparing meals and keeping the household running smoothly while John focused on the land. The children, Emily and Sam, began to understand the importance of careful observation and responsibility. They helped when they could, learning from their father's example that even small actions mattered when done consistently. By the end of the part of the drought, John had begun to see results that exceeded his expectations. The cattle were healthier, the pasture near the spring remained vibrant, and the community started to take notice. News of his success spread slowly but surely, and some ranchers traveled long distances to see his methods firsthand. John did not seek recognition, but he understood that the potential to help others had grown from his quiet, daily routine. He continued his 3 times-a-day checks, not out of necessity, but out of habit, out of respect for the land and animals that depended on him. Each visit to the spring, each adjustment to a channel, each note he recorded became a thread in a larger tapestry of care and innovation. He was not an inventor in the traditional sense, nor a leader by ambition. He was a rancher who observed, learned, and acted consistently, and that consistency was beginning to create change. As the sun set on one particularly long day, John stood at the edge of the pasture, watching his cattle move slowly toward the troughs he had carefully built. The golden light of evening cast long shadows, and he felt a quiet satisfaction. The drought had tested him, challenged him, and forced him to think differently, but it had also shown him the power of careful observation and steady action. He knew that the work was far from over, but he also knew that he had found a path forward. That night, as he returned to the house for the final time, he reflected on the importance of paying attention to the smallest details. A spring that might have gone unnoticed became the lifeline for his ranch. Channels dug with care, daily checks, and careful notes had turned potential disaster into hope. John realized that history, in a small but meaningful way, was already beginning to change because of simple, thoughtful acts repeated day after day. Even as he lay down to rest, the sound of the wind in the trees and the distant lowing of cattle reminded him that the work never truly ended. But he felt ready. He had learned to face challenges with patience, observation, and steady action. And though the world outside the ranch might not yet understand, John knew that the lessons he was learning would not only save his cattle, but could one day help others as well. The morning air was crisp and clear when John Miller stepped outside, the sun barely peeking over the distant hills. The ranch had settled into a tense rhythm, with each day bringing new challenges, yet also small victories. John had learned that the key to survival during the drought was careful observation and consistent action, and he was ready to take his efforts one step further. He moved toward the spring, the lifeline of his ranch, carrying a small notebook and a few tools. Each morning he checked the flow, the clarity, and the temperature of the water, noting the slightest changes. He had discovered patterns over the past few weeks, tiny shifts in flow that hinted at how the water moved underground. It fascinated him. The land seemed alive, communicating through subtle signs that only patience and attention could reveal. After observing for several minutes, John began sketching a new plan. The channels he had dug before had helped, but he realized they could be improved. Some areas of pasture still struggled, and the cattle sometimes crowded around the main trough, leaving weaker animals without enough water. He decided to create smaller channels leading to secondary troughs, ensuring that every part of the pasture received water. This required careful digging, precise leveling, and constant monitoring to make sure nothing went wrong. Neighbors passing by on their morning chores noticed John working with determination. Some whispered among themselves, saying that he was taking risks with the land and the water. Others were curious, quietly admiring his diligence. John ignored the chatter. He had learned long ago that results mattered more than opinions. What he did today might seem unusual, even unnecessary to others, but he believed in the process and in the patterns he had observed. By mid-morning, he had completed the first channel. It was shallow but direct, guiding water to a patch of pasture that had struggled the most. He watched the flow carefully, adjusting the path with small stones and wooden stakes. The water moved steadily, reaching the far end of the field and creating a soft, glistening path across the earth. John smiled, knowing that this small action could make a big difference for the cattle that depended on it. After the second round of morning chores, John walked to the barn to check on the young calves. They were healthier than they had been a few weeks ago, but he noticed one or two that seemed slower, less energetic. He knelt beside them, checking their coats, their legs, and their behavior. These calves, born into the drought, required extra attention. John carefully measured their feed and water intake, making small adjustments to ensure they received the care they needed. Every detail mattered, and he treated each animal with the same patience and respect he gave to the land itself. Word of John's efforts began to spread slowly. Some neighbors who had initially mocked him now asked questions about his methods. They wanted to see the channels, the spring, and the water management techniques firsthand. John welcomed them, showing what he had done without boasting or claiming credit. He explained simply, pointing to the flow of water, the placement of troughs, and the observations that guided his decisions. The neighbors listened closely, some taking notes, others simply watching in quiet admiration. The drought persisted, testing John's ideas and resolve. One afternoon, a sudden gust of wind knocked over part of a channel he had worked on. Water spilled onto dry land, and the cattle panicked slightly, jostling one another for access to the remaining troughs. John acted quickly, reinforcing the channel with rocks and digging a small diversion to restore the flow. The incident reminded him that even the best plans could be disrupted by unforeseen events, but it also reinforced the importance of staying calm and thinking clearly in the face of challenges. By late afternoon, John had completed a second set of channels, creating a network that allowed water to reach nearly every part of his pastures. He stood on a small hill, looking down at the intricate web of flowing water, and felt a sense of quiet triumph. This was not the work of a moment. It was the result of careful observation, patient experimentation, and relentless determination. Each adjustment, each check, each small repair had built toward this moment. John continued to refine his methods over the next several days. He experimented with different angles for the channels, different depths for the troughs, and even small dams to control the flow during particularly hot afternoons. Each experiment was carefully noted, every result recorded in his notebook. He treated the land like a living laboratory, learning from successes and failures alike. Some ideas worked perfectly, others required modification, but nothing went untested. Evenings on the ranch became times of reflection and quiet planning. John would sit on the porch with his notebook, reviewing his observations, considering what adjustments might be necessary for the next day. The wind carried the distant sounds of cattle and the faint rustle of grass, creating a peaceful backdrop to his thoughts. He often thought about the larger implications of his work. If he could save his cattle during this drought, perhaps his methods could help others as well. The thought gave him quiet satisfaction and a sense of purpose beyond the boundaries of his own ranch. Martha and the children watched John's dedication with a mix of admiration and concern. They knew the work was exhausting, yet they also saw the hope it brought. Emily helped her father measure small adjustments to the channels, while Sam learned to observe the cattle and note changes in their behavior. John encouraged them patiently, teaching not only the practical skills of ranching, but also the values of responsibility, observation, and perseverance. The family had become a small team, each contributing in their own way to the survival and success of the ranch. Neighbors began to notice the results more clearly. Cattle on John's ranch were healthier and stronger than those on surrounding properties. Grass remained green near the channels, and the overall vitality of the ranch stood out against the dry, brittle landscape around it. Slowly, other ranchers began to ask more serious questions about his methods, seeking advice and guidance. John answered generously, sharing what he had learned without hesitation or pride. He believed that knowledge was meant to be shared, and that helping others could only strengthen the community as a whole. Challenges continued to arise, however. One afternoon, a minor flood caused by an unexpected rainstorm threatened to wash away one of the main channels. John acted immediately, diverting the water and reinforcing the banks with rocks and soil. The incident reminded him that nature was unpredictable and that every plan required flexibility and adaptation. He carefully documented the adjustments, considering how future channels could be designed to withstand similar events. Through all of this, John never lost sight of the cattle themselves. He observed their behavior constantly, noting which animals were thriving, which needed extra care, and which might require additional feed or water. He walked among them with a quiet attentiveness, speaking softly and moving deliberately so as not to startle them. The animals responded to his care, moving confidently and calmly within the spaces he had created for them. By the end of the part of the drought, John's work had begun to have a noticeable impact. The pastures were healthier, the cattle stronger, and the spring seemed to respond predictably to his careful management. The rhythm of his daily routine, morning, afternoon, and evening checks, had become more than habit. It had become a tool for survival, a way to shape the environment around him. John felt a quiet pride in his efforts, not for recognition, but for the knowledge that his persistence was making a real difference. Evenings were still a time for reflection. John would sit quietly, reviewing his notes and thinking about the next steps. He considered possible improvements, imagined new channels, and thought about how his methods might be applied to other ranches. The work was far from over, but he had established a foundation that would carry forward through the rest of the drought and beyond. His family remained a constant source of support. Martha ensured that the household ran smoothly, preparing meals and keeping the children organized, while Emily and Sam continued to learn from their father. Together, they had become a team, each contributing in their own way to the survival of the ranch. John often thought about how important it was to pass on not only practical skills, but also values: patience, observation, perseverance, and a quiet determination to do what was right. As the sun set, John walked across the fields one last time, watching the water flow through the channels and the cattle graze peacefully. The land had changed subtly under his care. The spring that had once seemed insignificant now sustained life, and the pastures that had struggled now appeared vibrant and alive. John understood that his work was not done, that each day would bring new challenges, but he also understood the power of steady, thoughtful action. That night, as he returned to the house for rest, John felt a sense of calm and accomplishment. He had taken risks, experimented with new ideas, and adapted to the challenges of the drought. The work had been exhausting, but it had also been rewarding. Each small step, repeated faithfully, had contributed to a larger success. And though he could not yet see the full impact of his efforts, he knew that the lessons he was learning, the importance of observation, persistence, and careful action, would last far beyond the drought itself. As he lay down to sleep, the wind rustled gently through the trees, and the distant lowing of cattle carried across the fields. John thought about the days ahead, about the experiments yet to be tried, and about the ways his careful planning could continue to make a difference. The rhythm of his life, checking the land and animals 3 times a day, observing patterns, making adjustments, was more than a routine. It was a method, a way of understanding and shaping the world around him. The night settled over the ranch, quiet and still, yet alive with the promise of the next day. John closed his eyes, knowing that tomorrow would bring more work, more observation, and more opportunities to refine his methods. The drought had tested him, challenged him, and taught him lessons that could never be forgotten. And as he drifted into sleep, he felt ready to face whatever came next, confident that persistence, careful thought, and quiet determination could turn even the harshest circumstances into a chance for survival, and perhaps something greater. The days on John Miller's ranch had begun to change. The patterns he had discovered in the spring and the careful channels he had built were producing results that were visible to anyone who visited. His cattle were stronger, healthier, and more active than those of neighboring ranchers. Even in the midst of the continuing drought, the pastures around his spring remained green, and the water flowed steadily through the channels he had created. John watched these changes with quiet satisfaction, knowing that careful observation and persistence were paying off. Word of his success spread slowly at first, carried by neighbors who had come to see the results for themselves. Some of these neighbors were skeptical, but they could not deny what they saw. The animals were thriving, and the land seemed healthier than the surrounding ranches. Slowly, more people began to take notice. Visitors arrived from nearby counties, curious to observe John's methods. He welcomed them politely, guiding them across the ranch, showing the channels, the spring, and the careful placement of the troughs. John explained his observations clearly, pointing out the patterns he had noticed and the adjustments he had made. He showed them how even small details could make a difference, how a slight change in the angle of a channel or the depth of a trough could affect the flow of water, and how careful attention to the cattle's behavior could indicate when adjustments were needed. He never boasted, never claimed to have all the answers. He simply shared what he had learned, hoping it could help others. As more people observed his work, the impact began to grow. Ranchers who had once been struggling during the drought began to experiment with similar methods on their own land. Some succeeded, others failed, but the ideas spread like wildfire. John's careful notes, which he kept in a small notebook, became a valuable guide for those willing to try. They saw that consistent attention, repeated daily, could make a difference even under the harshest conditions. The county officials took notice as well. Reports of thriving cattle and green pastures reached their offices, and some came to see the ranch in person. They were impressed by the practical methods John had developed and by the results he had achieved without relying on complex technology or large amounts of money. It was a solution that could be applied to many ranches, helping communities survive the drought and maintain their livelihoods. John worked harder than ever. Each morning, afternoon, and evening, he checked his channels, his cattle, and the spring itself. He made adjustments where necessary, reinforcing channels with rocks, improving the flow, and ensuring that every part of the pasture had access to water. He also paid close attention to the cattle, observing their behavior, measuring their intake, and noting any signs of fatigue or stress. It was meticulous work, demanding both patience and careful thought. His family continued to support him fully. Martha managed the household, keeping meals ready and helping Emily and Sam understand the importance of their contributions. The children had become skilled observers themselves, noting changes in the land and the animals and reporting them to their father. The ranch had become a small laboratory of life, with John at its center, guiding experiments and adjustments with quiet determination. The drought showed no sign of ending, yet the results of John's efforts were undeniable. Fields that had once struggled were now green and thriving. The cattle were healthier than ever before. Even neighboring ranchers who had been skeptical at first began to adopt similar methods, improving their own herds and pastures. John had not intended to influence anyone beyond his own land, but the impact of his work was beginning to spread naturally. One afternoon, as John inspected a newly reinforced channel, a young rancher approached him cautiously. "Mr. Miller," he said, "I don't know how to thank you. My cattle were losing strength every day, and now they're moving better than they have in months. Your methods, they really work." John nodded, speaking softly but clearly. "It's nothing magical," he said. "It's all about observation and care. Watch the land, watch the animals, and act on what you see. Small changes can make a big difference." The young rancher left, inspired and ready to apply what he had learned. John watched him go, a quiet satisfaction warming him. This was not about recognition or reward. It was about knowledge, shared in a way that could improve lives and protect the land. He realized that his routine, his patience, and his careful attention were creating something larger than himself. His daily work was beginning to influence the community and, in a small way, the course of local history. That evening, as John walked the fields for the final check of the day, he reflected on the lessons he had learned. The drought had tested him in ways he could never have imagined. It had forced him to observe more carefully, think more creatively, and act more decisively. But it had also taught him the power of persistence and patience. By paying attention to small details and repeating careful actions every day, he had not only saved his own ranch, but also inspired others to do the same. The county officials returned a few days later, accompanied by agricultural experts. They walked the pastures, examined the water channels, and observed the cattle. They asked questions, took notes, and listened closely as John explained his methods. It became clear to them that the techniques he had developed could be applied widely, offering a practical solution to challenges that affected many ranchers in the region. They left impressed, promising to share what they had learned with others. The impact on the community was immediate. Ranchers who adopted John's methods saw improvements in their cattle and pastures. The knowledge spread not through textbooks or lectures, but through practical demonstration and personal observation. John's quiet diligence had created a ripple effect, influencing not only his ranch but the surrounding area. He remained humble, never seeking recognition, but the results spoke for themselves. One afternoon, a young journalist arrived at the ranch. He had heard about John's methods and wanted to write a story. John agreed, showing the journalist the channels, the spring, and the healthy cattle. The journalist asked questions, took photographs, and noted every detail. John spoke simply, explaining how careful observation, repeated daily checks, and thoughtful adjustments had saved the ranch and inspired others. The article was later published, spreading John's ideas even further. Despite the growing attention, John remained focused on his daily routine. Each morning, afternoon, and evening, he walked the fields, checked the water flow, and observed the cattle. Every detail mattered. A slight change in the water level, a minor adjustment in a channel, a calf that appeared tired, all required attention. His diligence had become more than a habit. It was a method, a way of understanding and influencing the world around him. Even Martha and the children noticed the change in the community. Neighbors stopped by more often, asking for advice, sharing their own experiences, and learning from John's careful observations. Emily and Sam began to understand the importance of knowledge and responsibility, seeing how small, thoughtful actions could influence outcomes far beyond their own ranch. The family had become not only caretakers of the land, but also teachers, sharing insights that could improve the lives of many. As the weeks passed, John continued to refine his methods. He built additional channels, adjusted the flow of water, and monitored the cattle with careful attention. The land seemed to respond, the pastures remained green, and the animals grew stronger. The drought had not ended, but the ranch was thriving despite it. John realized that his work had created a blueprint for survival, one that could be replicated and adapted by others facing similar challenges. One evening, as he completed his final round of checks, John stood on a small hill overlooking the ranch. The sun was setting, painting the sky in warm shades of orange and purple. The cattle moved calmly through the pastures, the water flowed steadily through the channels, and the fields looked healthy despite the harsh conditions. He felt a quiet sense of pride, not for recognition, but for the knowledge that his persistence and careful planning were making a difference. John knew that history was not only made through grand events or famous achievements. Sometimes it was made quietly, through small, consistent actions that influenced the lives of many. His routine, observing the land and animals 3 times a day, adjusting the channels, recording every detail, had begun to shape the community and offer hope during difficult times. He had discovered the power of patience, observation, and thoughtful action. That night, as he lay in bed, the wind whispered through the trees, and the distant lowing of cattle carried across the fields. John thought about the days ahead, about the experiments he still wanted to try, and about the ways his careful methods could continue to help others. He realized that his work was no longer just about survival. It had become a source of inspiration and knowledge for a wider community. The ranch had changed, the cattle had thrived, and the land had responded to his care. The drought remained a challenge, but John felt confident that his persistence and careful observation would continue to produce results. The community had begun to recognize the value of his methods, and the influence of his work was spreading quietly but steadily. As he closed his eyes, John reflected on the lessons he had learned. The importance of patience, careful observation, and consistent action had been proven through experience. Small changes, repeated faithfully, could create large impacts. His routine, once a simple habit, had become a tool for survival and influence. And though he had not sought recognition, he understood that his work had begun to change history in a quiet, meaningful way. The dawn arrived with a soft pink light spilling across the hills, and John Miller rose as he had every day, ready for the routine that had become both rhythm and a tool for survival. The ranch had changed in ways he could hardly have imagined just weeks before. The spring he had carefully observed and nurtured now flowed steadily, supplying water to channels that spread across the pastures, and the cattle moved with strength and calm, grazing in the sun with a vitality that had once seemed impossible during the drought. John walked along the first channel of the day, notebook in hand, recording the flow and noting slight changes. Every morning, afternoon, and evening, he repeated this ritual not out of habit alone, but because he understood that the health of the ranch depended on careful attention. Even small details mattered. A shift in the water level, a calf that lagged behind the others, or a patch of pasture that appeared less green than usual. These observations guided his decisions and ensured that no problem went unnoticed. The results of his efforts were now evident not only on his ranch, but across the surrounding area. Neighboring ranchers had adopted his methods, and many reported healthier cattle and greener pastures. Word of John's success had spread through the county, reaching officials, agricultural experts, and even local newspapers. People marveled at the practical wisdom behind his work, the simple combination of observation, patience, and action that had turned a potential disaster into thriving life. John never sought attention, yet he began receiving visitors regularly. Ranchers came to learn from him, agricultural experts came to study his methods, and occasionally journalists arrived to document the story. He welcomed all of them with quiet humility, showing the water channels, the spring, and the thriving pastures. He spoke simply, explaining how careful observation and repeated action had saved his cattle and could help others survive similar challenges. He emphasized that success came not from luck, but from persistence, thoughtfulness, and a willingness to act on what the land revealed. The county officials took John's methods seriously. They recognized that his simple, practical approach could provide a model for sustainable ranching during droughts. Some officials worked with him to organize small workshops for local ranchers, sharing the techniques he had developed and explaining the principles behind them. John participated willingly, guiding others patiently and demonstrating that careful attention and consistency could overcome even the harshest conditions. Despite the growing attention, John remained focused on the ranch. Each day brought new tasks, new observations, and new adjustments. He reinforced channels, monitored water flow, and checked the cattle with meticulous care. The routine that had guided him through the early days of the drought now served as a framework for a broader mission. It was not about fame or recognition. It was about ensuring that the land and animals thrived, and that knowledge could be shared to benefit others. Martha and the children continued to support him fully. Emily and Sam had become skilled helpers, understanding the importance of observation, record-keeping, and careful care for the cattle. They learned to notice subtle changes in the land, to monitor the behavior of the animals, and to help their father adjust the channels when needed. The family worked together seamlessly, each member contributing to the health and success of the ranch. The lessons John taught them extended beyond practical skills. They learned responsibility, patience, and the importance of careful thought in every decision. Over time, the drought began to ease. Rainfall returned gradually, and the land started to recover naturally. Yet even as the rains came, the benefits of John's careful work remained. The cattle were strong, the pastures were thriving, and the lessons he had learned about observation, patience, and careful action continued to guide him. The routines he had established, 3 daily checks, careful record-keeping, and attentive care, had become second nature, and their results were evident in every healthy animal and every green pasture. John also noticed the growing influence of his work beyond his immediate community. Ranchers who had adopted his methods shared their own successes with others, creating a ripple effect that extended across the region. Agricultural experts cited his approach in discussions about drought management, and local schools used his story to teach practical lessons in observation, responsibility, and the impact of careful action. John had never imagined that his quiet persistence could reach so far, yet the evidence was clear. His small, thoughtful actions were changing lives beyond his own ranch. One afternoon, as he walked the fields during his final round, a neighbor approached him with a sense of awe. "John," the man said, "you've done more than save your cattle. You've shown us a way to survive even in the toughest times. We owe you more than we can say." John shook his head gently, smiling. "I only did what I thought was right," he replied. "Pay attention, act carefully, and never give up. That's all it takes. You can do it too." The neighbor left, inspired, and John continued his walk, observing the cattle and the channels. He paused at the spring where it bubbled up steadily as it had for weeks. He knelt beside it, placing his hand in the cool water, and allowed himself a quiet moment of reflection. This spring, which he had once barely noticed, had become the heart of his success. By observing it carefully, taking consistent action, and learning from small changes, he had created a system that sustained life and inspired others. As evening approached, John stood on a small hill overlooking the ranch. The setting sun cast warm light over the fields, and the cattle moved calmly through the pastures. The water flowed steadily, nourishing the land and the animals. He felt a deep sense of fulfillment, not for recognition or praise, but for the knowledge that his persistent care had created something lasting. The work he had done, quietly and diligently, was now having an impact far beyond what he could have imagined. John understood that history was often shaped not by grand gestures, but by consistent, thoughtful action. His daily routine, checking the land and animals 3 times a day, observing patterns, adjusting channels, and recording details, had become more than habit. It had become a method, a tool that influenced the community and created a model for sustainable ranching. The lessons he had learned and shared would continue to benefit others long after the drought ended. Even as he walked back to the house that night, John felt the weight of his responsibilities, but also a quiet satisfaction. The work was never truly finished. The land required constant attention, and the animals depended on his care. But he now knew the power of persistence, observation, and careful action. The methods he had developed could help not only his ranch, but countless others facing similar challenges. He had discovered that even small, consistent efforts could change the course of lives, and perhaps history itself. That night, as he lay in bed, the wind rustled gently through the trees, and the distant sound of cattle settling for the night filled the air. John reflected on the journey he had undertaken, from the first signs of the drought to the careful observation of the spring, the construction of channels, and the eventual thriving of his cattle and pastures. He realized that his persistence, thoughtfulness, and careful attention had created something far larger than he had ever imagined. The lessons of the drought would remain with him forever. Observation was crucial. Even the smallest signs could indicate larger patterns. Persistence mattered. Daily, repeated actions could create profound changes. Thoughtful action, grounded in knowledge and patience, could overcome challenges that seemed impossible. These were lessons not only for John, but for his children, his community, and anyone willing to pay attention. In the days that followed, the ranch continued to thrive. The channels worked perfectly, the pastures remained lush, and the cattle grew stronger. John maintained his 3 times a day routine, not because it was necessary to survive, but because it had become a way of life, a principle that guided every decision he made. His family continued to learn and contribute, ensuring that the knowledge and methods he had developed would be passed on to the next generation. Visitors continued to arrive, eager to learn from his success. John welcomed them all, demonstrating his methods, explaining his observations, and sharing his philosophy of careful attention and consistent action. He emphasized that the success of the ranch did not come from luck or grand gestures, but from persistent effort, careful observation, and the willingness to act on what one learned. His story inspired many, proving that even ordinary people, when guided by patience and diligence, could create extraordinary results. Over time, John's influence spread further. County officials promoted his techniques to help other ranchers during dry seasons. Agricultural schools referenced his work, and local communities adopted practices that reflected his careful methods. John never sought recognition, but the results spoke for themselves. The quiet diligence of a single rancher had created a ripple effect that improved the lives of many and left a lasting mark on the region. One evening, as John finished his final round of checks and returned to the house, he paused to look back over the fields. The sun dipped below the hills, casting long shadows and golden light over the pastures. The water flowed steadily, the cattle moved calmly, and the land seemed to glow with life. John felt a profound sense of fulfillment. He had faced challenges, observed carefully, acted consistently, and made a difference, not just for his ranch, but for the community, the county, and the lives of countless others who had benefited from his work. As he entered the house and joined his family for a quiet meal, John reflected on the journey that had brought him here. It had begun with simple routines, repeated faithfully, checking the land and animals 3 times a day, observing patterns and making careful adjustments. From these small, consistent actions had grown a system that saved lives, inspired others, and quietly changed history. John understood that greatness often came not from fame or wealth, but from persistence, attention to detail, and the courage to act thoughtfully in the face of challenges. As night fell over the ranch, John climbed into bed with a sense of peace. The work of the day was done, the cattle rested, and the pastures thrived. He knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, as it always did, but he also knew that he had the tools, the knowledge, and the persistence to meet them. His quiet dedication, his careful observation, and his repeated daily actions had created a lasting legacy, a legacy of care, diligence, and meaningful impact that would endure long after he was gone. And in that quiet, reflective moment, John Miller understood that he had changed history, not through grand gestures, not through fame, but through the simple, consistent acts of observation, care, and thoughtful action that had shaped the land, saved the cattle, and inspired an entire community.